Hi and welcome to the Global Travel Planning Podcast. I'm your host, Tracy Collins, who with my expert guests will take you on a weekly journey to destinations around the globe, providing travel inspiration, itinerary ideas, practical tips and more to help you plan your next travel adventure. Hi, everybody, and welcome to episode 34 of the Global Travel Planning Podcast. Now, this week, I am so excited to have a guest on who, if you're a listener of our UK Travel Planning Podcast, you will know who this is as soon as he introduces himself, because he has been on at least 2 episodes of the UK Travel Planning Podcast. In fact, one of our most popular episodes on that podcast is with Rob. There's given away. Your episode about London, Rob, is one of our most downloaded episodes, so I will say that. But anyway, today we're going to talk about a Pennsylvania road trip that Rob took a few months ago, because I'm, again, fascinated to learn more about America. And I know we have listeners from all over the world, whether you're from the States and haven't visited Pennsylvania, or from America, or the UK, or anywhere in the world. I think it's great to find out about different destinations around the world. So anyway, without further ado, I will stop rabbiting on, Rob, and would you...
Quite the build-up. I mean, I'm stressed now.
Don't be stressed. You're a pro. So, Rob, would you like to introduce yourself and tell us whereabouts in the world you live?
Sure. Well, like Tracy said, I'm the Rob, I guess. And I have a lovely wife, Heather, and we are both middle school teachers, and we have a lovely son who I can't believe is 14 years old, Beckett. And we currently live in Columbia, Missouri, which is pretty much smack dab in the middle of our country, conveniently located between Kansas City and St. Louis.
And we have still got to visit, Rob. I know we have promised we will come over there. It will happen at some point. You know, Doug is absolutely determined to get over, and we'd like to spend a bit of time exploring the States for sure. And I'm sure this trip is going to also give us a bit of inspiration. So can you give us a brief overview of your trip? Who did you go on the road trip with? Where did you go? And how long were you on the road for?
Well, you know, we are a road trip family, always have been, towards the end of this past summer. And our life revolves around our son's basketball right now. And so most of our road trips are related to where he has to go and play basketball. I don't think I told you, we had a potential road trip planned out west because he was going to play in Las Vegas, which I know is another destination, Doug, and you want to hit someday.
We do.
So we actually had a road trip planned through Oklahoma and Texas and New Mexico and Arizona, and a couple boys on his team got hurt, and so that got canceled. And we were like, oh gosh, we only have 2 weeks left before school starts. We got to go someplace. And so I was born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I still have aunt and uncle there and cousins. And we said, we haven't seen them for a while. Let's go to Pennsylvania. Even though I was born there and raised there until I was 9, still, it's a long state, lots of things to do. But we decided to head out there. It's a relatively quick drive. We can actually make it in a day, although we took our time a little bit this time. But we were on the road for about a week and went through, we used Harrisburg as our hub, which I think using a hub is always a good technique when you're road tripping. I hadn't been there since I was a little kid, so I don't remember anything. And then went to Hershey's, Pennsylvania, which we'll talk about more.
Yeah.
And then just looking on the map again, centrally located Harrisburg is in Pennsylvania. We decided to hit Lancaster County, which is home to a very large Amish population here in our country. And then Gettysburg, which we'll talk about as well, obviously home to kind of the turning point in our Civil War, and Lincoln Gettysburg Address for those people that are familiar with that. And my wife is a social studies teacher and a Lincoln lover. So all places that my parents never took me, even though I'm from Pennsylvania. So we headed east.
That's brilliant. Well, I think sometimes, you don't actually explore the places that are on your doorstep when you grow up.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm exploring more of Northumberland now than I think I did when I was a kid, to be honest.
Isn't that funny? I mean, I asked my parents, I'm like, how come you never took me to these places? Well, we'll talk a little bit later. I mean, Pittsburgh and the area around Pittsburgh, there's a ton there as well. So,
Well, I actually have a relative who lives in Pittsburgh. Actually, I have my dad's cousin. I think it's
you're
his cousin.
kidding.
Yeah, or his nephew. I always get mixed up because my grandmother had my father before her mum had her last son. So I think it might actually be my dad's uncle, which is very bizarre. Who was a bit younger than him, still is a bit younger than him. But yeah, that's very common. So he lives in Pittsburgh. I believe it might be something to do with the coal, because obviously Northumberland, coal mining,
yes.
Pittsburgh, coal mining. So I figured that's that relation. Anyway, let's go back to the trip. So you started off in Harrisburg, which is the state capital. Am I right?
That is correct.
So what are some of the highlights of your stay, and would you recommend it as a starting point for this time?
I will be honest. I mean, I'm going to say a lot of wonderful things about my home state here, but I think all my fellow Pennsylvanians would agree that Harrisburg is not a destination. But, I mean, in Missouri, our capital is Jefferson City. And those of you that are maybe familiar with Missouri in Jefferson City would say the same thing. Sometimes state capitals are in very odd places. Most of them are put there because of geographical reasons, whether it's, access to rivers or back in the days, railroads. And they didn't necessarily grow up into wonderful tourist destinations.
So that's good to know. I did not know that. So there, see?
So we chose Harrisburg mainly because it's centrally located. We kind of, like spokes on a wheel. It was close enough to everything, like half an hour to Hershey's, an hour to Amish country. I think it was 45 minutes to Gettysburg. And of course, the closer you get to tourist destinations, the more expensive hotels and everything else are. And so we kind of went back and forth. And, we could get a much better deal in Harrisburg for lodging and accommodations. And that's why we picked it. Harrisburg, the capital's lovely. If you're into history, we went downtown, we went to the Capitol. There are lovely things to do down there, but definitely not a tourist destination.
Okay, perfect. But it sounds like a good place to stay if you get better deals on accommodations. That gets
absolutely
from me, Rob.
It worked lovely.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's talk about Hershey then. So,
oh my gosh,
chocolate.
If you love chocolate and you have the chance to go, how can you not go? I mean,
exactly.
I can remember being a kid and hearing about Hershey's. I mean, when I told my students at the beginning of this year, I went to Hershey's, and they were like, there's a town called Hershey, like there's a place. And I'm like, yes. And I told them a little bit about the quick history that literally, I think his first name was Milton. Hershey's was a chocolatier who he traveled the world. He did research. He learned how to make chocolate, and of course, brought back his knowledge from traveling all these different places in the world and started a chocolate company and built the town around it. And the kids are like, God, that sounds like Willy Wonka. I said, I know. So yes, if you're a chocolate lover, it's definitely a place that was wonderful to visit. They have a theme park there. So if you're a theme park lover, and we are, so I can speak that it is worth a visit. Great roller coasters if you're into roller coasters. They have a lovely chocolate world. I mean, I'm not going to lie, it's very commercial. It's a tourist destination. But the biggest gift shop of chocolate and candy that you've ever seen.
Oh, I don't know. I've been in the Lindt chocolate shop.
Oh, we missed that.
Switzerland. And obviously the Cadbury World in Birmingham is pretty good as well. It sounds like I visit a lot of these chocolate places. I'm not saying anything. I might be nodding my head at the moment, but so I think I need to add Hershey's into.
You do. I mean, it was great. I mean, they've got a food hall and they've got a little dark ride that teaches you about the process of Hershey's. And then there's paid attractions inside that you can do. We did the make your own chocolate bar activity, which was pretty cool. They've got a restaurant. We went to the restaurant and it actually was very good. The chocolatier there in Hershey's. And of course, I would say at least 80%, if not more, of their food involves chocolate somehow. Chocolate dusted or cocoa nibs or chocolate sauce. Beckett got some ribs with chocolate barbecue sauce. I mean, so it's fun. It's fun. It was good food. Crazy milkshakes.
Does it have hot chocolate for Doug?
Oh, of course they do. Of course they do. And I mean, if you saw the milkshake Beckett got, I mean, I'm sure the hot chocolate had probably, 5 inches of whipped cream and chocolate on top of that. So, oh yeah. I think that might give some competition to some of the hot chocolate we had in the UK when we were there. Because that was pretty good stuff.
Oh yeah, it's pretty good. It is pretty good. But Doug likes his hot chocolate. I'm a milkshake person, so that sounds pretty good to me.
Oh, it was. They were pretty impressive. And then the town itself is just, it's a very picturesque town. They've got, and of course, it's all related to Hershey because he basically built the town. But they have beautiful botanical gardens. They have a couple historical hotels that you can stay in. We took a trolley ride that took off from the chocolate world for about an hour that does like a historical tour of the town and Hershey. And it's now this huge school that he and the company now support. And so the town is very, very much built upon Hershey's and lots of history to learn. So again, if you're into history, you've got that. Beautiful botanical gardens, you got that. Thrill rides, you got that. Chocolate, obviously got that. So there's a lot to be offered, for kids and adults.
So would you say 1 day or 2 days to visit Hershey?
I would say at least 2 days. And again, like the amusement park also had a water park within it. So if you have kids, you could easily spend a day or two just at the amusement park and the water park. And then at least a day at the chocolate world. And then if you were wanting to do botanical gardens and maybe a tour, there's another museum downtown. I mean, you could easily make it into 3 days if you wanted, but at least 2, definitely 2.
That sounds brilliant. Right. So let's talk about Gettysburg, because I'm going to be really ignorant here about I know it's of historical significance. So tell me a little bit about Gettysburg. Obviously, famous historic site, but you're going to explain a little bit more of that to me and our listeners.
Absolutely.
You don't know.
Well, yeah. So American Civil War. So we're talking. Oh gosh, I need Heather here for my dates. 50s, 60s. So yeah. So Pennsylvania as a whole. I mean, because we're on the east coast of our country, so lots of historical places on the east coast of our country. Obviously. Lots of battlefields throughout Pennsylvania and neighboring states. So Gettysburg is widely seen as the turning point of our Civil War. And shortly afterward, when the Civil War ended, that's where Abraham Lincoln came back and he gave his famous Gettysburg Address at the conclusion there. So I never went as a kid, and obviously Heather being a social studies teacher, very interested. And then our son. So we adopted our son, and he's African American. So whenever we do travel within our country, we do search out places of historical significance, obviously not just for ourselves, but for him as well. And so it was a great visit. It was a sombering visit. I'm sure a lot of people who have been to places of historical significance where, tragic events. Our Civil War, any country, anywhere is a tragic event. This was one of our largest battles with one of the largest casualties on both sides. So wonderful visitor center, museum. If you're into history or battles or the Civil War and what led to that horrific event, the museum was amazing. Our son, for the most part, was very tuned in to going through it and reading things and asking questions. And it was at times kind of hard. You're trying to explain Civil War, and especially our Civil War and the basis for our Civil War, to your child, who also happens to be African American, at times it was really, it's kind of hard. Like, and then you realize it's not something that's far removed. I mean, we're still within 200 years. So, that's not that long ago. There was a beautiful one thing that I had never heard of before. It's called a cyclorama. It is a painting, kind of a mural. It was done by a French painter. And then I don't know if he painted it in France and then brought it to America, but it's a mural of the Gettysburg battle. And it's been restored and it's placed in the museum in the round. So you kind of enter and you are surrounded by this. It's like 42 feet high.
Wow.
And like almost 400 feet in circumference. And then they have a little audio thing that goes along describing the battle. And that was just, I mean, the painting was beautiful. But then, of course, the topic, it was great. And of course, there's a film that goes along with it. But I have not been to New York and the 9/11 memorial, but I've been to places like Oklahoma City. For those people that know, there was a bombing there many years ago, the federal building. And so you go to these places to learn your history, to experience your history. But when you're like there, you're literally there.
Yeah.
It's tough. We kind of broke the the tension and the heavy of the subject area, and went to lunch though, and found we always are looking for cool places to eat, and found a tavern there in Gettysburg that dates back to 1776.
Wow.
And the tavern's in the basement of this called Dobbin's House, the Spring House Tavern, because there's literally a spring that runs through the basement where this tavern is. So we had a great meal in this dark little tavern. Also, kind of a surprise that we had not read. This tavern was a spot on the Underground Railroad, which, again, if you're not familiar with American history, the Civil War was largely based on the differences between the North and the South, and whether enslaving people was okay or not. And so the Underground Railroad was a kind of a system to get enslaved people from the south of our country to the north. And so we got to see kind of some of the secret places within this house and tavern where they would hide people to get them to the north where they would be safe. So that was a kind of a nice little surprise we hadn't planned. And then we headed out to the battlefield. The battlefield is huge. I mean, it almost is like the town. I mean, the town was the battlefield. And so, there are still, I think, a couple homes from that era that have bullet holes in the side of the houses because the town was the battle.
Wow.
And you can have ranger tours. There's so many options for people. And so if you're a big history buff and big into the battles, I mean, you could spend probably a couple days, because I know some people are it's complex. It was a big battle. We took an audio tour in our car.
Oh, really?
Yeah, which was something new. Yes, it was something new. It was one of the options we saw, that you could download this app. I can't remember how much it was, but it was very cheap. And you set up your phone and GPS, and it tells you where to drive. And as you come to certain markers, it just automatically started telling you about it. Yeah,
it was really cool.
It was very cool.
Yeah, I heard of that before.
I was kind of like, how's this going to work? But really cool option, especially if you had smaller children, they're probably not going to want to be walking all over the place. And sometimes with the Rangers, they're talking kind of at a higher level. Whereas if you're in the car, you can kind of go at your own pace and then talk to your kids about what's actually happening. But we drove around the battlefield probably for a good hour and a half, and you could get out when you wanted. They have, of course, markers all over the place where different brigades from different states were positioned, and it It was a lot. It's
It sounds like.
a sombering place and a sad place, but also a place where you're like, in my view, we were victorious and things did go the way we needed them to go. But a lot of, obviously a lot of blood was spilled there. So it's also a very solemn place to visit.
Yeah. Okay, let's turn the topic around, because that'll do definitely somewhere that we'll want to go and visit for sure.
Yeah.
I think it's important too. But I also have an interest in going to Lancaster and Amish country. Now, who doesn't? Who doesn't have an interest in this? Because it's so unique. Well, I don't know a huge amount about it, except again probably what I've seen in films and occasional documentaries, and a little bit about the Amish lifestyle. So talk us through that.
Yeah. Well, and if you live in America, just like you, that's where you get your information about the Amish. It's through movies and TV shows, and we've had some crazy TV shows here in America about Amish, and there's all sorts of opinions and sometimes even controversy, and there's all kinds of things flying around. And so, one of the great things about traveling and being able to have that luxury to travel is to go see things for yourself and get a different point of view instead of just reading about it or having people tell you about it. And so we went with no real preconceived notions about what we were going to see. And it was interesting. It just adds to our personal, collection of knowledge about the Amish. I will tell you, the Amish, it gets kind of complicated because there are many subgroups of Amish. If you start reading about it, you'll be like, oh my goodness, there's this type and that type. And then there's a group called the Mennonites, which is also related to the Amish. And, it all started, I think they started in Switzerland, and then they came over to the colonies like many people did at the time, early 1700s, because of religious persecution and all of that. They've settled in many different states in our country, I think also even up in Canada. And just one of the larger populations is there in Pennsylvania. So, we went, and it's a lot of farmland. Farming is one of their major industries, although clearly tourism has also become one of their major industries as well, which is an interesting juxtaposition when you're there.
Yeah, it does sound, but just thinking about it, it sounds strange.
Yes, that is a very good word. So, we started the day going to a farm. So there's obviously farms everywhere. You can choose probably from 40 different farms that you could go visit, with all sorts of options to do all sorts of things. We went to, it was called Old Windmill Farms in Lancaster County. And we just did a short farm visit. We love animals. So we always, even when we were in the UK, one of our things was, we got to go stay on a farm. And so we stayed there for about 40 minutes. It was interesting to see. We were led around by the children. We didn't, the adults weren't doing the tour. It was the older children that were leading us on the tour, because they work. One of the kind of parts of their culture is that the kids, they pitch in and work, hopefully like all kids should, but it's different. The expectations are definitely different. And so, of course, we had fun with the farm animals and held all sorts of things like baby goats and baby piglets and fed the baby cows. But at the same time, I'm thinking, what's life like for this family and these children day to day? I mean, she was clearly a teenager who was doing most of the tour with us, and very, very well spoken and command. I'm like going, wow, she's like leading this whole thing with this group of people. And so, as a parent and as a teacher, I appreciated her abilities to do what she was doing. But then you're also wondering, okay, so what is life like on a daily basis and for your future. Like because after that farm tour, we took a buggy ride. So if people are ever familiar with kind of the black buggies that you might see in the movies and TV, because some groups of Amish and Mennonites do use motor vehicles and some don't. So it kind of depends on what group you are.
Right.
So there's different rules for different subgroups and sects. And I'm not an expert at all, but I think like most people, especially in the States, when you talk about Amish, there's confusion about, okay, well, I thought you aren't allowed to use electricity. Well, clearly we bought our tickets on the internet to go to these things.
So they have a website.
Yeah, they have a website, but yet, so it was very, like, I don't know if it really helped us clear up in our minds, kind of the overall, like, so like you said, it was an odd, not a contradiction, but it was
Sort of a
interesting.
juxtaposition, isn't it, between the modern and the
the old.
Obviously the old, but the old, I mean, and I think, when I think of Amish, again, I think of no electricity, no motor car, no TV, no internet, no phones.
It's selective. And I wish I had more time to talk to somebody. When we took the buggy ride, our driver, Elam was his name. He's probably like in his late 60s, early 70s, appeared to me being very traditional. Our son, our son, well, currently now is 6'6", 6'7". He's a big guy. So on this buggy ride, initially all three of us were supposed to be in the back. And Elam was so sweet. He kind of looks at Beckett and is like, and he looks at me. He's like, you can ride up front with me. He clearly was like, you all aren't going to fit in the back. So I got to sit up like shoulder to shoulder, like in physical contact.
Oh, that's cool.
And I kind of thought, I'm thinking to myself, like, is this okay? Like, I have some preconceived notions, but I don't know. But that I think was a really good opportunity because at the beginning, I kind of was sitting there kind of stiff, trying not to rub against him too much. But as the drive went on, I started to ask him questions. I mean, he kind of had a script that he was following, telling us about the farms and what they were growing and kind of how their way of life goes. And I just started asking him questions and we actually started a conversation. And then, he slowly started to actually make some jokes with us. I can't remember the joke he said, but it was something about like, Beckett and, his big feet or, how much food it must take to, maintain him. And, we started to talk about children and, in that moment, that's another thing about traveling. If you get to go out of your way to talk to people and you start realizing, okay, we're all Americans and we all live in the same country, but your way of life is completely different than mine. But when you start talking about teenagers and raising teenagers, well, you know what? Teenagers are the same no matter where you are in the world.
Absolutely.
There's those common themes no matter where you are in the world, no matter what's going on in the place where you live. Teenagers are teenagers, know? And so I felt like a little barrier had broken down there. And I really felt like, oh, he had another buggy ride to give. But I'm like, I feel like we could go out to lunch and I could actually have an opportunity to maybe learn some more about their culture and the way they live. He was asking us about Missouri. He's like, what does Missouri look like? I mean, he started to ask me like questions off the script. And I asked, he has never left Lancaster County in his 60, 70 plus years. Like that's been his life.
Wow.
And I guess, that's when you go, we're privileged to be able to travel in the first place. And a lot of people do. They stay in their spot in the world their entire lives. And so There are opportunities in Lancaster County where you can go spend a whole day with a family, have dinner with them in their house. There was one farm where they had the one room schoolhouse. You could spend the day. So there's many opportunities in the area to immerse yourself further and learn more. We're on a time limit there, but
That sounds
that was a lot of fun.
Yeah, it sounds really interesting. And that's definitely add that to my itinerary as well, because just as you say, it's I'm not American. I'm British, Australian, but even visiting America, I can go to Los Angeles, I can go to New York, I can go to Chicago, meet people who all have different lives, and that's the amazing thing when you travel, is the ability to, the privilege of being able to do that wherever you go in the world. And just, I mean, I'm very nosy. That's
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think that's why we travel, because we are nosy.
I want to know about your life. I want to know what is it like? And I remember actually one of my driver guides in the UK saying, he loved going out when he takes the drives, because people want to ask things like, how do you take your garbage out? How does it collected? We have dustbin. What different language that we call it a dustbin lorry, not just things like that. Just things that are really mundane but really interesting. Like what's it like? I was a teacher. What's it like at school? Like, when the kids start school, what sort of subjects do they do? All those things that are so different, that if you're just in one place, you just take for granted that everybody has exactly the same, but it's not. We're all different. So I'm going to turn us back to Pittsburgh, because I know that's your hometown. So, and you stopped there. Now, I've not been to Pittsburgh. The closest I've been is to Buffalo, New York.
Oh, hey.
Because my stepdad was working in Pittsburgh. So tell us about, is Pittsburgh worth visiting?
Oh, yes. I mean, I feel like I'm going to be the Pittsburgh tourism board here. I love Pittsburgh. I mean, I assume most of us have a warm feeling when we go home, whatever that home means, or wherever it is, or what have you. I mean, I was born there and I lived there until I was 9, and then my family flipped the world around and moved us to San Diego, California, which is as night and day as you can possibly get. So that's another story we can. I can talk about San Diego almost just as warmly. But if anybody goes to Pittsburgh, I wrote this down because I didn't want to forget. So Pittsburgh, if you don't know, is located at the convergence of 3 major rivers, and it's very hilly. And so there's a lot of tunnels and a lot of bridges, which I don't know why, but I love tunnels and bridges. When I was a little boy, I just loved driving through the tunnels. And back in the 70s, people would honk their horns and cause all sort of havoc in the tunnels. Can't do that anymore. I think you could get arrested for that kind of thing. But there's several tunnels that lead into Pittsburgh, because it's kind of surrounded by rivers and mountains. You have to enter Pittsburgh through what's called the Fort Pitt Tunnel. So Fort Pitt is actually a fort, again, from the early years, that's located in Pittsburgh at the convergence of these rivers. So you can go to Fort Pitt as well. But when you come through the Fort Pitt Tunnel, you kind of enter it, and it's just like a tunnel and kind of like a boring mountain in front of you. And you come out of the tunnel, and the beautiful city of Pittsburgh just appears with the rivers and the skyline and the bridges. See, I'm just like, it's one of my favorite things in the world to go through that tunnel and see the city open up. I think many people have said it's like the best way to enter an American city anywhere. So Fort Pitt Tunnel, if you have to make a detour and go there, drive around to the tunnel.
Make sure you go through the tunnel.
Oh my gosh. But yeah, I mean, I love Pittsburgh. My aunt and uncle still live there. My grandparents no longer with us, but lived there. And we lived, my maternal grandmother's from Italy. And so one set of grandparents lived very near downtown in an area called Braddock, which is very typical immigrant American place with brick streets still, and a mixture of anything and everything as far as cultures and backgrounds. So I'm very lucky that I was born there and got to experience that. My aunt and uncle still live in a place called Swissvale, which is right outside. I mean, it's one of the boroughs. So Pittsburgh has boroughs, kind of like neighborhoods. So if you ever go there, have you ever heard the word hoagie?
I have, but I don't know what it means.
Okay, so they're very large sandwiches.
Right.
Okay, like I'm trying to think of another word. See, I've always called them hoagies. I don't even know. I know other people call them something else, but very large sandwiches. And so if you ever go to Pittsburgh, you got to go to the Triangle Bar and Grill because they are known for their hoagies, best in Pittsburgh. And you get a battleship. They're called different ships based on their length. It's like 27 inches almost long. And so, of course, we showed up. And, of course, immediately my uncle's like, okay, you want to go down to the bar and get the hoagie? I'm like, oh, yeah. Total little hole in the wall. They've redone it, though. When I was a little boy, we'd walk in and it was what's the word? It was a place back then. It was dark. It was dark. It was a bar. But they've brightened it up since then. So we had to get our hoagie. And then where my aunt and uncle live, you can see right over the end of the street that they live on. Another place you have to go in Pittsburgh is called Kennywood. Kennywood is, if you are a theme park or roller coaster enthusiast, you know Kennywood. And if you don't know Kennywood, you got to go Google it right now and go read. It is one of the oldest amusement parks in America. Back to 1898, it was originally a park. There used to be trolleys that went all around Pittsburgh. And they built parks at the end of the trolley lines to try to encourage people to use the trolleys as transportation. And so a lot of these parks disappeared, but this park continued to develop and morphed into what is now called Kennywood. They have some of the oldest wooden roller coasters in the world. Now, I've actually been to Copenhagen and Tivoli, and I rode a wooden roller coaster there. Those people that are familiar with Tivoli probably know what I'm talking about. And that, I think, I don't know if that's the oldest or...
I think it might be.
Yeah, I think that might be the oldest one. That, the driver still is on the coaster with you, working the handbrake at the one in Tivoli. But the one at Kennywood goes all the way back to 1920, the one that's still standing. And it's called the Jackrabbit, and it's got a double dip.
Yeah.
And it's one of the few roller coasters that the only restraint they have still is like a seatbelt.
Wow.
No, yeah. So when I was a boy, that was the scariest thing to go on because it wasn't even a seatbelt back then. It was literally a leather strap, kind of like a belt with little holes that went on a hook. And you would go down the double dip because it was called it's called the Jackrabbit, and you would fly out of your seat on the we took Beckett. We've been back to Pittsburgh many times over the years. When Beckett was 3, I snuck him on because, again, as you know, Beckett is tall. And so when he was 3, he looked like he could probably be 6 or 7.
Yeah, I can imagine.
And against Heather's protest, I said, oh, he'll be fine. And I took him on. That was his first roller coaster ride, was at Kennywood on that over 100-year-old wooden roller coaster. And so he loves that. He loves that one.
I bet he does.
It's a beautiful amusement park. It doesn't have the gardens and all the restaurants of Tivoli, but it's like the closest thing. It's not huge. It's not small, but it's a place where you can kind of stroll and enjoy the day. And
sounds like
very close to my heart.
I was gonna say, it sounds a lot of fun and a lot of nostalgia there as well.
Yeah.
I can hear.
But yeah, Pittsburgh's got everything. Downtown's great. You were talking about the coal, so obviously Pittsburgh's known for the steel mills, which I still remember from back when I was a little kid. They're all gone, obviously, and the rivers. I can remember as a kid, the rivers were horribly polluted and weird colors. And Pittsburgh is definitely one of our cities that has, energized itself and redeveloped areas down by the rivers where the steel mills were. So again, lots of history, not only from, pre-Civil War and Civil War, but just the Industrial Revolution and steel mills, and people that are familiar with Carnegie Mellon and some of the big business tycoons of our country's history have their hands in that area. So yeah, you could spend many days in Pittsburgh.
Well, I'll have to add that in too. So how did this road trip compare to other road trips that you have done? Because I know it's something that you like to do. Was anything unexpected on this road trip? Or?
I think, the only unexpected thing, we did have a fire alarm at the hotel one night. So we had to get, don't you hate, have you ever had to do that?
Well, you mentioned that. Doug and I stayed in Cardiff in September. And I think it was about 2:00 in the morning, the fire alarm went off and it didn't stop. It just didn't stop. So we got dressed. You get up, get dressed, went all the way down to the reception. Obviously, you can't use the lift. I don't know what floor we're on. I think we didn't quite make it all the way down before they went, it was a false alarm. We're like, so I'm glad it was a false alarm, obviously.
Well, yeah. I mean, let's right.
Yeah. But also it was like, right, okay, back to bed. Yes. So did you have a similar?
We had a similar, and total coinkydink. We were sitting out there in the parking lot, of course. So obviously we're in an election cycle here in the U.S., and a certain presidential candidate was visiting Harrisburg that night, and the motorcade went by. So we're like, oh, well, that's when we didn't get to see anything other than, all the highway patrol cars.
Yeah, I can imagine this.
Yeah. So that was kind of funny. So yeah, we had to evacuate the hotel, saw, a motorcade. But no, we had a blast. We love to get out of town right before the school year starts and just be the three of us together. And that's why we like road trips, because you're with each other, in the car and every stop and in the wherever. So it was great. No car. That's always a thing on a road trip, right? The car performed like a champ.
Perfect. Perfect.
So no, it was a great re-energizing road trip.
It sounds great. And I agree with you. I just love road trips. We didn't do a huge amount of road trips in the UK, but since we've lived in Australia, we've done far more. And we just love doing the outback in Queensland on a road trip, because it's fantastic. So I'm going to invite you to Australia, Rob, to bring over.
We're going to come someday. Heather's like, I can't do that flight. I said, well, yeah, you can.
Yes, you can. Just break it up bit by bit. You can stop off in Hawaii on the way, fly to LA.
She hasn't been there yet, so we'll make that part of it.
There you go. Exactly. When you're retired from teaching, that is the time you guys come and we'll go on an outback road trip around Queensland, because that'll be absolutely be so good. So I'm going to ask the last question that I always ask in every podcast, but what would be the one tip that you would share with anyone planning a road trip around Pennsylvania for the first time?
Well, definitely go. Say definitely go. And I think the same thing I said when planning a trip to the UK. And maybe it's the teacher in me, but I'm like, you got to read. You got to put some work in ahead of time. And that includes, if you have children, that you're somehow prepping them for the trip. Whether it's a short road trip of 3 or 4 days or big long odyssey, I think for you and anybody else that's going along with you to get the most out of it, that you're putting that time and money and effort into doing it, is to read about the places that you are going to beforehand. Don't wait until you get to Gettysburg to start learning about it. Start learning before you get there. Even though, like I said, Harrisburg is not a destination. I read about the Capitol, and I didn't know this, even being born there, that the original Capitol had burnt down, and then they had rebuilt it, excuse me, and it was this ugly rectangular prism-looking building, and nobody really liked it. And then they built the third, I guess, version of the Capitol building, and they built it kind of around the second one that was so ugly. So part of the building is like the old ugly building with kind of facade and addition, so those little things, when then you actually get there, you're like, hey, I know this, and that's okay. This is more interesting than it would have been if I hadn't known it. So I always encourage people to read, and then just looking at a map and seeing relative locations of things. I think that's a tricky thing that sometimes we think either places are farther or shorter than they really are. And so looking at a map and doing a little pre-planning, you might be surprised that something you didn't think was on the table to visit is, oh, really? It's only 35 minutes away? Well, how can we pass that up? We should try to fit that in. So read, look at a map, look at the distances, especially on a road trip, and you might save yourself a headache because something was farther than you thought, or might get a nice surprise to visit something that was closer than you thought.
Perfect. That's perfect. And very, very good advice. I always say there's nothing worse than going to visit somewhere and then a couple of days later finding out that there was something else that you should have visited, which was very close by. And I can tell you, I've done that before. So I'm going,
everybody has.
Exactly. So very good advice. Thank you so much for joining me on this week's episode of the Global Travel Planning Podcast, Rob. We will hopefully get some photos of the different places that you visited from you. And obviously, we'll put some links to some of the places that Rob mentioned, particularly some of the places to go and eat. It sounded great. And you can find that the show notes at UK Travel Fun at globaltravelplanning.com/episode 34. You can tell I've been doing lots of UK travel planning podcasts this week, Rob. But thanks so much for joining us on this week's episode.
Absolutely. Always a pleasure talking with you, Tracy.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of the Global Travel Planning Podcast. For more details and links to everything we discussed today, check out the show notes at globaltravelplanning.com. Remember, if you enjoyed the show, please consider leaving us a review on your favorite podcast app, because your feedback helps us reach more travel enthusiasts just like you. Anyway, that leaves me to say, as always, happy global travel planning.